Welcome to The Commute, a Bible study podcast designed to turn your commute into an opportunity to grow in your faith. Whether you're sure of what you believe or you're not sure what to believe, this podcast is designed to help you better understand who Jesus is, what the Bible's all about, and how that applies to your life today. I'm your host, Pastor Matt, and I'm excited to dive into this week's episode of The Commute.
Well, hey, welcome to The Commute. I'm Pastor Matt.
And I'm Pastor Casey.
And, as we get ready to dive in, we realize that in our planning for The Commute, we were actually about 2 weeks ahead. So last week we talked about Mark, which is not coming up for you till next week. In 2 weeks. So hold on to that. That's some good stuff. You can use that later. And then today we're actually finishing out Luke. So we apologize for being ahead. We've got the schedule fixed though now. But it's really exciting that we're in Luke, because I think this crucifixion scene that you're going to come across in Luke 23 is powerful. But I think it also shares just kind of the scandalous nature of grace. And I don't think that we take time enough to meditate on the reality that grace itself is scandalous. But that's not just good news for your friend and neighbor. I think that's good news for you when you really think about how scandalous grace is.
Absolutely. So what kinds of things should we highlight and emphasize in this?
Well, I think one thing that you were pointing out when we were talking about this before, when we realized that we made a mistake and all the Mark reading I did was useless for today. But in 2 weeks, I'm going to be ready to go. I think one of the things you pointed out that I think is really interesting to point out is you've got a lot of stuff that Jesus says on the cross that you don't find in the other Gospels.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So in Luke, there are 3 different sentences or so that Jesus says from the cross, and they are unique to Luke's gospel account. So you don't find them in Matthew, Mark, or John. And what I find fascinating about the portrait you get of Jesus on the cross in Luke is that you get a Jesus that is in complete and total control over the circumstances. And you see him exercising his control in various ways. You see it first, I'm just going to go ahead and point the 3 words from the cross out here. So the first one is in Luke 23, verse 34. And Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." So you have a picture of Jesus here actually forgiving the people who are executing him. And in the midst of great pain and great suffering and great injustice, because they are, after all, crucifying an innocent man, Jesus still says, "Father, forgive them." It takes incredible control, I think, to say something like that in those circumstances. So that's the first one. I'm sure there's more we can say about it, but I'm just going to motor through all 3 here really quick. The second one is in verse 43. Jesus is talking to the thief on the cross, and you see him exercising some control over entrance into the kingdom of heaven. The thief asks Jesus to remember him when he comes into his kingdom, and Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." So even hanging on the cross, Jesus is exercising his control and his authority over entrance into the kingdom of heaven. And then the last word from the cross is a few verses later in verse 46. This is the moment of Jesus' death. And you see that Jesus' life is not taken away from him. Jesus is the one who lays down his life when he says in verse 46, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." So a key reading tip is when you're reading narrative accounts, pay close attention to the dialogue, because very often dialogue is how you develop a character and how you get to know their heart. And by what Jesus says in this account, I think it's pretty clear to say that Jesus remains the one who has the authority, who has the power, who has control, even in the midst of circumstances like his own death.
Yeah, and I love that point you made about, pay careful attention to what the character is saying, and I also say what character is saying it. So, like, for example, Luke highlights here, at the end, you have the centurion, so leader of, the evil Roman Empire, right? The one who would be considered a Gentile. And he says, surely this man was innocent. So he points out what the Jewish people should have seen, and he's the one that highlights, here's this perfect sacrifice. How do we know it's perfect? Because he was innocent. I don't think a Roman centurion has ever uttered those words standing before somebody on a cross, because the cross was kind of the worst kind of punishment. And so essentially it's like standing there watching an execution going, he didn't do it. He's innocent. Which I think is powerful. But, I think the other thing that stands out, Casey, when you share those words is, the injustice of it all, but how this story speaks to different people in different places. Recently I was reading John Perkins' biography, Let Justice Roll Down, that he wrote. And John Perkins lived through Mississippi in the days of the Jim Crow laws, moved away into California, said, wouldn't come back, came to know Jesus, and decided that he needed to be doing ministry in Mississippi, in the height of racism and injustice in our culture there. And, he shares this just tragic story of injustice that he experienced, and God's own healing process in these words of Jesus. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. This account of Jesus on the cross is what gave Perkins the healing and the fuel he needed to be able to look at those that had done injustice to him, to be able to forgive. And so I think that's where it's really interesting how these narratives, they speak to us in powerful and controversial ways. Nobody would tell somebody that experienced the level of injustice that John Perkins experienced, that, hey man, you should forgive. You should look at those around you and say, Father, they don't know what they're doing, forgive them. But that's the scandalous nature of grace. God's narrative speaks to us in a way that nothing else can, and calls out of us things that this world can't call out of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you see the scandalous nature of it all play itself out in a more personal way in the thief on the cross, right? Because it's basically a pronouncement of forgiveness and renewal at the 11th hour for somebody you would least expect to be worthy of that kind of forgiveness and grace. So I read this and marvel at it that this is how it's happened, and this is how it's preserved for us to read and study and talk about today.
Yeah, and I think that thief on the cross, when we really slow down and think about it, it speaks uniquely into our lives when it comes to grace, and it challenges, I think, a lot of our assumptions when it comes to grace and being able to connect with God when you think about it. Because, something interesting, I've found sometimes if I'm not careful, I will over sanitize the stories of the Gospels. I'll take the thief on the cross and I'll put it in a stained glass window and I'll make it prettier than it actually was. And I think in doing that, I lose the heart of what the story is really trying to tell me, And, when it comes to the thief on the cross, you look at this story and it's scandalous on like several different levels. I mean, level number one is you've got Jesus and he's being crucified between these two. And I love I love how Luke puts it, criminals. So I think even when you see that description of them, we oftentimes call it the thief on a cross. And I think when we brand it the thief on a cross, we kind of give it maybe even a lighter tone than it actually was. Because a thief, oh, somebody stole something. Like, do they really deserve punishment? But it was just an over-punished culture kind of thing. Luke's not saying that. He's saying criminals. He's not saying, revolutionaries. He's not trying to put a good spin on it. He's giving you just enough information where you can kind of say, whatever they did, they deserve to be there. So you've got the two guys that deserve to be there, and then the one that doesn't, Jesus. And they're being crucified. And this is it. I mean, this is the end. This is the nail in the coffin, right? There's nothing you can do at this point. You can't make up for any wrong you've done. Sentenced, done, finished. You're just waiting for your last breath. And I think that's what's really intriguing about this story, is it sets up this idea of grace as something that can meet us in our very last moments when we can't do anything.
Yeah, and I think you see a pretty stark contrast between one of the criminals and the other. What does the one criminal want Jesus to do? He wants Jesus to save himself and the criminals, basically asking Jesus, hey, Jesus, can you restore my earthly life? While the other one says, don't you understand? We're under a sentence of condemnation here, and we're under that sentence justly, but this man has done nothing wrong. So the one criminal, or I should say the other criminal, instead of asking Jesus to restore some earthly life for him, lays himself at Jesus' mercies and says, hey, I trust that you are in fact the Christ, and you being the Christ means that you're not necessarily here to restore my earthly life, but I trust that you are the one who can actually provide eternal life. So just remember me, please, when you come into your kingdom. And you almost see the other criminal saying to himself, yep, there's nothing left that I can do. I cannot earn my life. It's almost like Jesus talking about the cost of following him, right? If anyone would come after me, let him take up his cross and follow me, deny himself. And what you have here, I would say, is a denial of self and taking up the cross literally and following Jesus. And Jesus says, yep, today you're going to be with me in paradise. It's astounding.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's interesting to read it. Its comfort is he gets to join in on the crowd making fun of the foolishness of Jesus and the foolishness of the situation, because it's really interesting. He says in verse, let's see here, 39, one of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." And I just think that's so interesting. New Living Translation translates it, one of the criminals hanging beside him scoffed. It's kind of like this, you couldn't do it if you wanted to. I can't believe in my last moments I'm seeing, something so ridiculous as someone who says he's God and yet he's hanging right next to me, which I think is really interesting. But I love that. I love that comment of the second criminal, because he's like, nothing I can do. I'm getting ready to meet God and really account. You know, if you thought this cross was account, this is just, this is just a preview for the real judgment that's coming. Just remember me, Jesus, because I know you're going to be sitting on a different side of that. And I think it's interesting too, because I think a lot of times in our faith life, we default to, let me justify why God would save somebody like me. Well, he saved me because I can do all this really good stuff. And we do that with other people, and we do it with ourselves. Like, we look at the Apostle Paul and go, yeah, Apostle Paul was terrible, but God saved him. And then he planted the early church. He wrote most of the New Testament. He's definitely, paid it forward, kind of thing. And it's almost like we have visions of ourselves in heaven having this conversation with other people. Oh, so why are you here? Like, what did you do? Oh, well, yeah, I was terrible before, but I wrote most of the New Testament after. You're talking to Paul, and then maybe that criminal sitting right there. Hey, what did you do? Well, I was dying on a cross, and I just kind of looked at Jesus and said, hey, remember me. And he said, you'll be here, and I was here. Like, you didn't do anything else? Nope. I'm standing right next to you, who lived a lifetime in the faith because of God's grace. And I think it's scandalous in the sense of, it forces me to step back and remember that grace is just that. It's grace. It's undeserved love and mercy. And I'm not so special that I don't deserve to be on the other side of it. But because of what God chose to do for me, I get to be in a different place than I deserve to be. And I think the thief at the cross just forces us to, like, really wrestle with that reality.
Yeah, because I mean, he's the person in Luke that is explicitly told they will be with Jesus in paradise, and it's a real life playing out of what Jesus talks about in Luke 9. I referred to it before, talking about taking up your cross and following Jesus. But just to reiterate some of that same section, and you see how the whole gospel fits together. You see Jesus say in Luke 9:24, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory, and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. But I tell you truly, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God. And it's the thief on the cross who is not ashamed of Jesus' words of, the Messiah has come so that he might die, but rise again so that those who follow in his footsteps may have that same life, and that there's nothing you can do to save your life. And actually, by trying to save it, you're going to wind up losing it. But those who in a sense lose their life in Jesus gain everything. It's the kind of thing where I'm even struggling to talk about it, because it almost feels too big for me to talk about it, and saying more might actually belittle it.
Well, and there's so many layers to it, and that's I think too, when you're reading these stories, realize just how many layers there are to it, and just even sitting there and shifting your perspective and asking yourself different questions can really even mine out more of the meaning, because like the other thing you look at here is, it's interesting, why are there two criminals? Well, I think it's really interesting that there's two criminals being crucified on either side of Jesus, because it also shows you that we're forced to respond to what's happening here in the crucifixion. And we can either mock it because it just appears too scandalous, like it would have for the first 3 centuries of the early church, which, guys, just remember, like, people didn't use the cross as an image of our faith for the first 3 centuries of our history in the church. It was too scandalous. until crucifixion was a memory in the Roman Empire, people did not consider the cross a symbol of their faith that they would wear around their neck. It was just, too gruesome a picture. But I think what Luke is showing us here too is there's this need to respond to what is happening. And what is your response to Jesus' crucifixion? Like, is it one of scoffing and mocking and what a scandalous picture? Or is it one of leaning in and being able to take hold of every benefit that gives you, the crucifixion? So that's kind of another layer to it. I think another layer shifts when I begin to ask the question, not what does this mean for me, but what does this mean for how I view other people? What does it mean for how I view the way we should be the church and ministry? Like, should we be the kind of church, it's really interesting. This is a side note. I was scrolling through Instagram and I came across this pastor that was preaching a message, and he was talking about how sometimes the wounds that are felt the deepest are the ones that are felt in the church. And he told this story of this prominent couple in the church that had donated a ton of money to create like a bridal suite in the church. So of course, when they donate a ton of money to create a bridal suite, what do? They put a nameplate right up there, right? This is so-and-so's bridal suite. And it says the woman and the husband ended up getting a divorce for whatever reason. Didn't say why. And there's this little daughter there, 8 years old. And it said the pastor called the mom in for a meeting at the church. And so she shows up with her 8-year-old daughter. And the 8-year-old daughter saw it, and it looked kind of weird because the pastor shows up to the meeting with a screwdriver, and they walk down the hall to where the nameplate is. And he removes the nameplate, hands her the nameplate, and says, "You're not welcome here anymore." And like, you look at that picture and you're like, whoa, it's like this lack of grace that doesn't seem to track with the church. And I think if you look at it through a lens like this, while obviously we don't know all the details of the story, is that the way we're supposed to be church? Or does this scandalous picture of grace call us at times as church to look just as scandalous in how we offer grace to those around us?
Yeah, it's definitely a question worth considering, because the truth is none of us is above the scandal of grace. And if we are followers of Jesus, been on the receiving end of a gift we could never repay, and we're all in the same boat. The playing field has been leveled, and I think it's important for us to remember that this is where all of us have been. All of us have been in a place where we just have to lay ourselves at Jesus' feet and ask for his mercy and his forgiveness. And he's given it to us and has called us to be a people who not only share that grace with one another, but share it freely. Yeah, it's definitely something we ought to ask ourselves and reflect upon.
And I think too, realize it will challenge you. And there'll be moments you look and you go, I've loved the thief on the cross. I've loved that person. But I think there's other moments that you'll step back and realize you've struggled to share that same kind of love with somebody else. Like Luke, the other theme that Luke has like ripe throughout his gospel is the least and the lost. The least of these is a big theme in Luke's gospel. He says, and he constantly shows Jesus ministering to the people that would be on the bottom rung of society and culture, the people that most people would look down on. And you see that in spades in this story. And so I think, man, realize that the scandalous nature of grace is not just something that we receive, but it's something that we're then called to give. And that's a challenge. But I think the challenge begins by realizing just what it is you received and how you've actually received it. And I think the more you do that, the more you will be a better reflection of the kind of Jesus that looks at a thief and says, today you'll be with me in paradise.
It's all good stuff.
Well, hey, thanks for letting us talk to you about Luke. We're pumped to connect up with you on track this time with our reading plan next week. Also, know that we've added the Commute not only on the Bethlehem Church Live mobile app, but the Commute is also on YouTube now. So you can go to YouTube and see a playlist of some of our most recent Commute episodes, when we've been doing video. And so if you'd like to share this out with friends, you can share it on the Bethlehem Church Live mobile app. You can share it from your favorite podcasting platform, or you can jump on YouTube, grab the link from our Bethlehem Church Live page, and share that out with somebody. But it's always great to know that we get to read scripture with others. And I pray that this podcast is a blessing to you and helps you dig a little bit deeper into what God is doing in his word. So until next week, it's been a joy hanging out with you right here on The Commute.
Thanks for checking out this episode of The Commute. For more information on The Commute or to join the Commute Bible reading plan, simply download the Bethlehem Church Live mobile app or go to bethlehemchurchlive.com/thecommute.